If you've ever looked at a map and thought, Ireland and England are neighbors, so their DNA must be basically the same, genetics has a surprise for you. Not because the two islands are wildly different at some deep human level, they're not. The people of Ireland and England share a lot of ancestry. They've traded, migrated, married, fought, and mixed across the Irish Sea for thousands of years. But when researchers analyze genomes in large datasets, using modern DNA, ancient DNA, and careful statistics, they keep finding patterns that most people don't expect. And here's the first shock: the biggest genetic differences aren't always Ireland versus England. Often, the sharpest lines are inside each island, between regions, coasts, and even neighboring counties. In other words, the story isn't Irish DNA and English DNA. The story is geography, history, and time, layer by layer. So in this video, we're going to explore what peer-reviewed genetic studies reveal about Ireland and England, what's real, what's misunderstood, and what the data actually suggests when you strip away stereotypes and family legends. Before we begin, a quick and important note: genetics is not identity. Your passport is not your genome. Your culture is not a set of markers. DNA studies describe patterns in populations, not the worth, purity, or value of anyone. And an individual can break every average pattern you'll hear today. Think of this as a weather map, not a rulebook. It shows trends, not destinies. Now, let's talk about what the studies actually do. When scientists compare populations, they usually look at autosomal DNA first. That's the mix you inherit from all your ancestors, not just one line. Then they use statistical tools to find clusters. Groups of people who are slightly more genetically similar to each other than to others, often because their ancestors lived in the same region for long periods. One landmark project that helped popularize this approach in the British Isles analyzed DNA from thousands of people whose grandparents were born in the same local areas. The goal was simple: reduce recent mobility, and you can see older regional signals more clearly. And the result was striking. The genetic map that emerges often mirrors geography. People cluster by region, and boundaries sometimes line up with historical kingdoms, migration routes, and natural barriers. That's the first difference people don't expect. Many people assume Ireland is genetically uniform, one island, one profile. But the data typically shows regional structure. That structure doesn't mean people are more Irish in one place than another. It means some areas experienced more outside influence at certain times, while other areas remained more locally continuous, often due to geography, lower population movement, or historical settlement patterns. And England shows the same thing, sometimes even more strongly. When you zoom in, England is not a single genetic block. There are gradients and clusters, north, south, west, east, shaped by different historical waves and later internal movements. So if you're expecting a clean split, Irish on one side, English on the other, genetics usually refuses to cooperate. What you see instead is a tapestry, and the threads change depending on where you stand. Now for the second surprise: the Irish Sea is both a bridge and a filter. For thousands of years, the Irish Sea connected communities. People crossed it for trade, raiding, settlement, and work. But it also separated populations enough that regional differences could persist and deepen over time. So you often see shared ancestry across the sea, especially in coastal regions, while still seeing distinctive signals within each island. This is where history becomes visible in the data, not as a simple timeline, but as overlapping layers. If you go far back in time, both islands share ancient layers that are common across much of Europe: early hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and later migrations during the Bronze Age that reshaped much of the continent's genetic landscape. Those deep layers are not Irish or English in the modern sense. They're older than the languages, kingdoms, and national identities we know today. But they form a base that both islands share. Then, more recent historical periods add regional texture. In England, many studies detect stronger signals of continental Northern European ancestry in parts of the East and Southeast. That shouldn't be shocking if you think about geography and history. The East Coast faces the North Sea. For centuries, it was a gateway, first for trade and movement, and at certain points, for large-scale settlement from continental Europe. Here's where people often oversimplify the story with two words: Anglo-Saxon DNA. The truth is more nuanced than the internet makes it sound. Early medieval migrations into what is now England did happen, and genetics supports that there was significant input in some regions. But it's not a clean replacement story. It's not the idea that the original population disappeared everywhere. Instead, what researchers often find is regional variation, stronger signals in some areas, weaker in others, blending into gradients rather than borders. That means you can have two people who both identify as English, both with deep roots in England, and one might cluster closer to groups influenced by North Sea migrations, while the other clusters closer to regions with more continuity from earlier populations. Neither is more English. They're just shaped by different regional histories. Now let's look at Ireland with the same lens. Ireland also shows regional structure and historical signals, but the pattern tends to look different. Ireland's position on the Atlantic edge, and its historical settlement patterns, often produce strong regional continuity signals in many studies. At the same time, Ireland was never isolated. There were interactions with Britain, with continental Europe, with the Norse world, and later with England and Scotland in complex ways that varied by region. Which leads to the third surprise: Vikings, Normans, and later migrations show up, but not always where people expect. When people think Viking DNA, they often imagine a huge, uniform stamp across entire countries. Genetics rarely shows it that way. Norse influence tends to be uneven. Often stronger in coastal regions, trading towns, and areas of documented Norse settlement. In England, Norse-associated signals may be more visible in places connected to the Danelaw and North Sea networks. In Ireland, Norse settlement historically concentrated in port cities and coastal hubs, places that became important urban centers. So the difference people don't expect isn't that one island has Vikings and the other doesn't. It's that Viking-era influences can be very localized and tangled with earlier and later movements. A coastline can carry a different signal than the inland countryside only a short distance away. And then there are the Normans. The Norman period gets talked about constantly in popular history, but genetically it's often misunderstood. The Norman conquest was hugely important politically and culturally. But political dominance doesn't always translate to a massive genetic replacement. Over time, yes, movement of people, elites, soldiers, and settlers contributes to ancestry patterns. But genetics tends to show that many historical events are complex. Sometimes the cultural shift is enormous while the genetic shift is subtle, and sometimes it's the other way around. Now, a huge part of why modern DNA alone can't answer everything is that modern populations have moved a lot, especially over the last 200 years. Industrialization, urbanization, and migration within and between islands blur older local signals. That's why ancient DNA is such a big deal. Ancient DNA studies take genetic material from archaeological remains and compare it to modern populations. This helps researchers see what the genetic landscape looked like in different eras and how it changed. It also helps correct modern assumptions. For example, people often attach labels like Celtic or Anglo-Saxon as if those are neat genetic categories. Ancient DNA shows that identities and cultures can spread through language, trade, alliances, and social networks, not only through mass movement of people. So ancient DNA adds context. It tells you what before looked like, what after looked like, and how gradual or abrupt a change might have been, region by region. Now let's talk about one of the biggest traps people fall into. Confusing haplogroups with full ancestry. Haplogroups are real, and they can be fascinating. Y-DNA tracks a paternal line, your father's father's father and so on. Mitochondrial DNA tracks a maternal line, your mother's mother's mother and so on. But those are only two threads in a massive web. If you go back 10 generations, you have over 1,000 ancestors in that generation alone. A single haplogroup represents one line out of many. So when someone says, this haplogroup proves I'm Irish, or this haplogroup proves I'm English, that's usually an overreach. Haplogroups can be more common in certain regions due to historical patterns, but they do not summarize your whole ancestry. Autosomal DNA is the broader picture, and even that is probabilistic and depends on comparison groups. This brings us to something practical: consumer DNA test results. If you've taken a DNA test and got Ireland or England percentages, you might wonder, why do the numbers change between companies? Why do updates shift results? And why can someone with a British Isles background get a result that looks surprisingly mixed? The answer is that these estimates depend on reference panels, groups of people chosen to represent regions, and on the algorithms used to compare your DNA to those panels. Different companies use different panels. Some panels have more samples from certain regions than others. Some regions are harder to separate because the populations have long histories of mixing and shared ancestry. And algorithm updates can refine or reshape boundaries. That's why peer-reviewed population genetics is helpful. It's not trying to assign you a neat percentage for a marketing dashboard. It's trying to understand real patterns, where clusters exist, how strong they are, and what historical processes might explain them. So what are the key takeaways, in plain language? First, Ireland and England share a lot of ancestry, but they are not genetically identical in every region. The differences that show up in studies are often about geography and historical contact, especially coastal gateways and migration corridors. Second, there isn't one Irish DNA or one English DNA. Both islands show internal structure, regional clustering and gradients that reflect centuries and millennia of local history. Third, historical waves, early medieval movements, Norse settlement, and later population shifts, tend to be uneven. Genetics often shows patchwork patterns, not uniform stamps. The unexpected differences are frequently inside the islands rather than between them. And fourth, identity is bigger than DNA. Genetics can tell you about ancestry patterns, not what culture you belong to, what you should believe, or where you really come from in a human sense. It's one lens. Powerful, but not the whole story. So if you've ever wondered why your family from one county seems to match a different cluster than your friend from another county, even though you're both from the same place, genetics has an answer. Local history matters. Coasts, ports, borders, kingdoms, and migration routes leave traces, subtle but measurable. And here's a question to make this personal. If your ancestors are from the British Isles, do you know the exact regions? County, town, coast, or inland? Because that detail often explains more than any national label. If you want, comment where your family roots are, Irish county, English region, or a mix, and I'll tell you what broad patterns peer-reviewed studies often find in those areas. And if you enjoyed this kind of what research actually shows breakdown, subscribe for more videos on Ireland, Britain, and the hidden history inside our DNA.